And so tonight I hope you also think of and imagine that Jesus may be calling you to a different kind of life. Asking you, do you love me? Do you love me more than all these other things? Well, you know, when I grew up, I spent wonderful childhood and youth time working in the church. I didn't grow up Methodist, but I grew up in a very tight Christian community, and I loved being able to work in the church, and I always felt that God was calling me to something special, but I could never quite put my finger on it. And so, you know, in this particular tradition, I had no imagination that a girl could grow up to be a minister. In fact, when I was in the 8th grade, you know, at the end of the 8th grade, you have these promotion exercises, and the person who had the highest grade point average got to give the speech. And my minister's son, whose name was John, he and I were always in competition for such kinds of things. And at the very last minute, evidently I must have beat him out because I got to give the 8th grade speech. And the Sunday following this 8th grade speech, I was going through the reception line for the pastor. Now remember, I beat out his son for this speech. And as I was going through the line, the pastor said to me, "Sally, that was a really good speech. It's too bad you're a girl. You'd make a great preacher." Well, give him a break. He had no imagination. Yeah. And I had no imagination either. It wasn't until I kept trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, and I went to college, and I figured I'll become a nurse. And maybe I'll even become a missionary nurse and go to some other country and serve Jesus that way. But while I was in nursing school, there was a college chaplain who was a woman. And she opened up my imagination. I could become a minister. I've always said that she was my calling made flesh, because I could imagine what ministry could be like because of her. Now, maybe there's somebody in your life who is your calling made flesh. Maybe you say, "I don't want to be a minister like all of those people in the way they do it." That's okay. But maybe there's somebody who does ministry the way you want to do ministry. Or maybe you need the imagination of your own soul to recognize that no matter what the obstacles are, God may still be calling and leading you. You know, in Minnesota Annual Conference, like many of the conferences, we have a big youth event once a year. And usually at that youth event, we have a workshop entitled, "Is God Calling You?" And one year I was teaching it, and I brought in some clergy to tell their call stories. And one of them, he's just a bundle of energy, relatively young, and he told his call story. Well, he's ADD. He has attention deficit. And so he was telling his story about how he never imagined himself going to college because school was so hard for him. He never imagined himself going to seminary because school was so hard for him. And he was telling the story and how he got over all of these obstacles. And as soon as this workshop was over, there was this young woman who came running up to him. And don't you know, she's ADD. And she couldn't imagine that she could be a minister until she heard his story. He was her calling made flesh. Who is it that is your calling made flesh? You don't have to be best friends with them. In fact, the woman who was my calling made flesh, she doesn't even remember me. But she made all the difference in the world for me. Who helps you to imagine that God is calling and equipping and directing you into ministry? Do you love me? Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than all of the things you've thought about before? All of the obstacles you keep putting in your way? Do you love me? Jesus asks. And Peter says, yes. Well, then Jesus comes to Peter again. And he says, Peter, do you love me? Now, this time, Peter must have been a little puzzled that Jesus would keep asking him this. But you know, maybe Peter needed Jesus to keep asking him because, you see, maybe Jesus needed to help Peter think about just what this was going to mean. What was the cost of this? Because, you know, Peter, throughout the Gospels, you know, as soon as Jesus asked, who do people say that I am? And who do you say that I am? I mean, Peter was the first one to raise his hand and say, you are the Christ. I get an A. And then Jesus says to him, but the Son of Man must suffer and die. And you must pick up your cross and carry it. And Peter says, no, never. And then, of course, even when he said he would never deny Jesus, the first thing he did was say, I never knew the man. Never saw him? Peter was always quick to respond. But maybe this time, Jesus needed to help him just think about what the cost is. Because in ministry, there is a cost. There is a sacrifice. Well, you know, when I went to my first church, it was on the near west side, inner city, Cleveland, Ohio. Yeah, all right. And it was a tough place in the late 1970s. And when I walked in, I went to this introductory meeting. The people in that staff parish relations committee, they looked at me and they said, this place is going to be hermetically sealed by Christmas. They didn't see much hope in it. And in fact, with a man who introduced me on my first Sunday, he was also the man who cleaned the church. So I'd spent a few minutes talking to him as I was preparing for my first Sunday, and he got up and he introduced me, and I quote, well, this is our new minister, and I like her a little better than I thought I would. But you know, you begin to work with folks, and they get into your heart, and sometimes you even get into their heart. But this was a tough place. Within the first couple of weeks that we were there, when I was there, Cleveland had court-ordered desegregation, busing kids across town. Now, the people in my church, let us say, were not highly enthusiastic about this. And so one of the first Sundays, I read a letter from our bishop that called for all the United Methodists to make a difference in the city of Cleveland around this desegregation and to be witnesses of peace. And this church could not believe that I would spoil a good appointment by reading this letter. But I read it because I just didn't know any better. It seemed like it made a lot of sense to me, that people would be peaceful and that they would be mindful of one another. And then as the time went on, we began to see that there were lots of problems in this community. In fact, the very first night, my husband and I were in this big old parsonage. We set up our bed and everything in the front room across the whole front of the parsonage upstairs. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, 75 motorcycles revved up across the street. It was a motorcycle gang who had taken over this whole part of the city. Next to it was a pornography center with a theater and a bookstore. Next to that was a storefront that had prostitutes. And so as we lived into this community, I have to say it was a little unnerving at first. But pretty soon, people begin to know you, and you begin to know them. And this community began to work together. And we managed to get the city of Cleveland to buy this pornography theater and tear it down and make it into a public library. And we drove out the motorcycle gang. I guess they went somewhere else. But pretty soon this was a neighborhood where people could work and live together. And you began to see lives changed. You began to see young people who weren't afraid to come out and to go to the library, and to go to the schools, and to go to the churches. And pretty soon you could see the incredible difference it made. But let me tell you, there were moments that it was downright scary.